Hello, welcome to this week's 8.9 Newsweek discussion. I'm Finlo Costain. A new report by Boston Consulting Group in collaboration with Textile Exchange and Qantas warns that the fashion industry is under pressure. Demand for sustainable fabrics, they say, could exceed supply by 130 million tonnes by 2030. To discuss how we meet the rising demand for sustainable fashion, I'm joined by Dr. Alana James from Northumbria University, Zoe Gilbertson from the UK Bast Fibre Network, and by Alice Robinson, author of Field Fork Fashion and co-founder of the company British Pasture Leather. Welcome all. Alana, can I come to you first? Why is the supply of sustainable fabrics going to become a problem? And what's your vision for the future of fashion?
So legislation, especially at an EU level, is changing really, really quickly at the moment. And companies across the fashion and textile value chain are really struggling to keep pace. We're currently seeing a lot of brands selecting preferred materials. And obviously what we mean by that is materials that have a lower environmental impact and that are obtained from sustainable sources. But this is usually in quite low quantities and at quite a conservative percentage of their overall materials falling into that category. So the implementation of this legislation, alongside an increase in pressure from industry and consumer groups, for example, is rapidly going to increase that percentage, with the speed of demand vastly being outweighed by the readiness of supply. In terms of the vision for future of fashion, obviously we know that the industry can't continue as it is. It can't continue to operate in that linear way with regards to manufacturing, use and disposal. And there's long been a need for that kind of top-down governance to drive forward more responsible behaviours. But we have to ensure that that shift is practiced in a meaningful way. So using methods that can be engaged with on a long-term basis rather than any kind of knee-jerk or quick reactions, which might have potentially short-term damage rather than the intended positive outcomes.
You mentioned EU law there and the way that that's going to create a big change. And we often sort of hear discussions about the role of government, the role of the legal system, and essentially sort of creating a new baseline, increasing that sort of expectation of a level playing field across the board. Do you think that other jurisdictions around the world are looking closely at the EU and that there'll be a sort of a ripple effect across the rest of the world? Or is this something which is largely going to affect markets coming into the European Union?
I mean, I would sincerely hope that some of the EU legislation is going to be leading the way. I would hope that that would have that ripple effect that we are kind of desiring. But one of the biggest issues is that there's no kind of collegiality across these legislations. So products that are produced in Bangladesh or the kind of Southeast Asia region, they don't adhere to those rules. So the complexity comes when we're starting to try and get those baselines across products that are both coming into the EU and being sold here as well. So it's much more complex.
Now, Zoe, you've said that you think we need a complete transition to natural fabrics. What does that mean and what does it look like?
Well, you know, like all of us, I'm pretty terrified by the state of the world, by pesticide, chemical pollution, synthetic dyes. And even though the EU is legislating to try and get rid of these, they're still in our water supply, they're everywhere, and they come from synthetic fabrics and dyes. And they're such a threat to our bodies and all living beings. And we have 6 times the amount of clothing in the world that we need, if you look at the stats. So the exponential increase in clothing production over the last 20 to 30 years has all come from synthetics. And natural production of fabrics is pretty static. There's only so much land available for growing fiber. And the fashion industry needs to massively reduce its production output. And a way to do this is through decreasing the supply of fabrics, not increasing them. And we don't need more clothing in the short term, but we do need to create the capacity to produce clothing within planetary boundaries. So for me, this means complete local production from the seed to the shirt, working within the biocapacity and limits of the land. We could all live with much less clothing and be absolutely fine. And I think the thing is to develop the capacity and the resilience within our local systems, within where we live, within our regions, our countries, and work with farmers and local people to develop the systems to do that and kind of almost forget about the fashion industry itself, because I think it just needs to reduce.
You say that the world has 6 times more clothing than it needs, which is quite a statistic. Where is it all?
Um, well, I think probably a lot of it is in people's wardrobes, Western wardrobes not being worn. It's piling up on the beaches in other countries, in Africa, in South America. And that is mainly polyester and synthetic based fibers, because they don't break down. And also people, they don't really like to wear them so much. They're not as long lasting as natural fibers in terms of, they are long lasting as in they're more durable. And this is what the EU legislation is focusing, is on the durability of textiles. Well, synthetic materials are more durable because they don't break down, they don't biodegrade, they don't wear out. And that is an issue for me with the legislation, because I feel it's flawed. I think most of us could look in our wardrobes and say, actually, I've got enough clothes, I can get on. And
So we need to sort of go in there, root through and take them to a recycling centre. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that's a possibility, but I think the recycling capacities they're not in place. They don't exist. Clothing's just piling up. And governments would do better to focus on, okay, genuine recycling facilities, but it's really difficult. And the market, it's more expensive, and the market doesn't shift without incentives. So people aren't going to do the right thing until they're forced to do the right thing. In terms of, when I say people, I mean bigger brands.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. Alice, lots of people see future fabrics as something that's processed still, for example, something that's made out of seaweed, or something that's grown in a field, so linen or flax. What do you see as the role for livestock? Do you think that they should be part of the future?
Yes. So I think when we're talking about regeneration and food and fiber systems, the role of ruminant animals in pasture-based landscapes is really crucial. And my background was in design, where I was trying to come at this question about what materials that I think I should be using as a designer, and the industry more broadly. And for me, making that distinction between the different practices that we have in agriculture and what the impacts of those are and how they differ is really crucial in making material choices. And at the moment, that distinction in terms of leather has not been made before we have understood that raising animals for food will result in a raw material that you could transform into leather, but never has there been an aggregation system that is looking at what is the impacts of what this type of animal agriculture has produced. And so I think that the same applies in our food system as it does to our fiber system, that not all materials are grown the same or produced the same, and that having that discourse around what preferred materials can be is really key. And so the conversation around either no leather or alternative materials, I think it's much more complex than that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people seem to associate leather production often in the same way that they associate petrochemicals and the use of synthetics in there. And the leather supply trade currently has quite a bad name. Why is that?
Well, I think it's for many reasons, from its association with animal agriculture and land use, and also in the production of the material, which are two very separate things. So
just in terms of the production for now.
In terms of the production, so there are many different ways that you can produce something that is leather, whether that is using natural barks and leaves and tannins to create like a vegetable tan leather, or whether you're using more of a chemical process, which doesn't result in a material that can return to land in the same way that a natural material can biodegrade without toxicity and return to soil. Similarly to the challenges around dyes and chemical use and plastic use in the finishes of leather, we have an assumption often that this natural material can look and perform as a plastic, whereas its natural character in terms of its durability, its repairability, all comes from the inherent character makeup of the fact that it's the skin of an animal that has been turned into a material that can last a very long time. And it's the additional inputs that we add to that really inhibit its the positive use it could be in a material supply chain in terms of preferred material.
And for you, what do you think are the key challenges in creating that that vision, if you like, of a fully integrated, more regenerative food and fibre supply chain?
Well, one of the challenges for us, our business, British Pasture Leather, that you mentioned, we have decided to try to build a supply chain that is separate from the normal commodity system of how we collect hides at great volume and transform them at a great volume into leather. So we're working with a network of farmers that produce all over the UK that are certified by Pasture for Life standards. And what's the challenge for us is that these farms are of a smaller scale and dispersed around the country. So to create a system that is decoupled from the centralized system means that it's very labor intensive, but that the information and the visibility of those farming practices through to finished material is really crucial in establishing leather as a material that has agricultural provenance and can be seen as a product of a regenerative system. One of the challenges
you mentioned there, Alice, you mentioned the way that you have this supply chain in terms of the primary production. You're working with Pasture for Life farmers, for example, to achieve that. But what about the processing, the infrastructure that's needed to ensure that the hide is able to be used as a leather product and that it can then be processed properly?
Yeah, and I'm sure that our challenges echo many in other natural fibre production chains, is that we have lost a lot of the infrastructure in the UK to produce material that can compete on some of the efficiencies that other parts of the world have achieved, so that we can't compete on price or volumes in the same way. We are incredibly fortunate that we are able to produce leather using a traditional vegetable tanning method by working with a British tannery. But what's really key for us is being able to have those infrastructures still in a local vicinity, which I know from speaking to colleagues in wool production and flax is that that's a real sticking point in terms of having the natural resource and having the community, the agricultural community in abundance in our region, but not having the infrastructure to be able to really retain the value of those materials to get them to market in a way that is really creating a fairer supply.
Zoe, we talked there, we looked a little bit at sort of harvesting and then at processing, but also the colouring as well of the fabrics. Do you have sort of similar challenges from a bast fibre perspective? And also, I think we should just explain what we mean by bast fibre. It's not necessarily a term that everyone's familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, we do have very similar challenges to leather and to wool. And bast fibres are hemp, linen, flax, hemp, and nettle. Things with a stalk that need a lot of processing to turn into a textile fibre. They need less processing to be turned into other materials. And I think all clothing and textiles should be viewed as a byproduct or a co-product, like leather, like wool. Bast fibres, hemp, flax, and nettle can be made in conjunction with other products. So flax and hemp can make many amazing products, but there are compromises, different methods of harvesting, different ways to grow for each method. But the more people start growing and the more we can develop robust local markets and supply chains, the more farmers might be willing to give a crop like flax a go and experiment with its potential. I've seen a wind turbine made from flax. I've been in the most beautiful house made from hemp, and I make my own hair gel, curly hair out of flax. And it constantly amazes me what can be done with it. But until limits are put on plastics, not just for clothing, but for all sorts of materials through legislation or taxation, there'll not be a fair playing field for farmers, and they can't be expected to take risks on something new.
And presumably that energy element that you talked about, there's a need to make sure that there's, good quality, low carbon energy that's being supplied, probably quite close by very often.
Absolutely. It's all interlinked. If we can create local energy systems, I mean, the research we're doing in the Bast Fiber network is to try and develop low energy processing methods. So potentially on farm or portable processing units that resource the very local environment. And it's a challenge, and it's there's a lot in development, but there's so much potential.
Fantastic. Alana, you're leading a project from Northumbria University to examine how the environmental impact across the fashion and textiles industry is measured and assessed. What sort of impacts will you be measuring, and what stages of fibre production process will you be focusing on?
Yeah, so we've just been awarded 1.9 million from the UK Research Councils to improve that method of assessment. So to look at how impact data is collated, analysed and assessed across the entirety of the value chain. So right from material sourcing right through to the end of life, and onto kind of methods of circularity as well. So we want to aid that more holistic approach to be taken in the future. So avoiding those siloed impact measures, or focusing on isolated parts of the value chain. So we're 3 months in at the moment to a 2-year project, and we're in the process of kind of critically analysing the current methods that are being used across the industry. So things like eco-label certifications, life cycle and assessment tools, and sustainable rating mechanisms, and considering how these feed into the policy that we were discussing earlier. So the landscape's really saturated at the moment. So our objective isn't to add to that, but actually to improve the authenticity, the reliability, and also the credibility from a scientific perspective. So the project responds to a lot of criticism that we've seen recently, especially late last year, into how life cycle assessment tools are kind of constructed. So we want to move beyond that kind of self-reporting mechanisms, to not be have vested interest from any kind of funders, but also to start looking at some of those absences of environmental impact measures, such as microfiber pollution, for example.
So you're looking at a whole range of different ecological measures there, not just emissions, for example. You couldn't just talk us through one or two of the metrics that you're sort of interested in?
Yeah, I mean, we saw heavy criticism last year of the Higg Index, an index that has been hugely utilised by the fashion industry, and those kind of challenges that I mentioned earlier around that kind of self-reporting mechanism, and also kind of utilising the siloed approach, but also scaling of data as well. I mean, we know just how vast the fashion industry is, and there being assumptions are being categorically made on very, very small data sets. So the Higg Index is definitely one of them. And they're obviously just relaunching themselves as the new Higg Index through Worldly. So we're really interested to see the launch of that next week. But also a range of kind of eco-label certifications as well, ranging from kind of organic certifications right through to the kind of cradle to grave approach that we see at the top end as well.
Thank you. Alice, cattle tend to get a bad name, and we were talking about leather earlier on, and why people perceive it as being something that's harmful to the environment. And we talked through processing, but let's look at the sort of the livestock angle as well, because cattle are supposedly, bad in terms of the climate impact, and elsewhere on 8.9, we've talked about that in detail and the way that that is a misleading piece of information. But firstly, do you think that that's a fair analysis of cattle? And secondly, do you encounter resistance within the fashion industry based on those sorts of perceptions towards building better leather supply chains?
I feel that I have had the great privilege of being on farms where I've seen the tremendous benefit that cattle have brought to those landscapes, to those ecosystems, and that they have been a vital tool in building resilience of soil health and being a part of an ecosystem for biodiversity to flourish. And so for me, that's a really crucial place to start in terms of talking about leather and talking about leather's connection to cattle, and that is not the same in all cases. I think that the word regenerative has really exploded in the fashion industry, and there's this huge view of regenerative agriculture coming to save the industry in that way, and that's where this gap in preferred materials, and that we're trying to switch them out. The reality is the scaling of regenerative agriculture and scaling of its connection through to finished fiber is where a tremendous amount of work needs to be done. So in terms of resistance, no, we've been met with a lot of positivity, because users of leather, or companies that have leather as a material that makes up the majority of their portfolio, have used it for many of its natural qualities around durability and repairability, and want to continue to do that. And they've used alternative materials that haven't quite met those standards of make or expectations of their customer. And so we've my usual response, and what we've tried to do as a company, is being able to take people onto those farms and to have that experience, which I feel sometimes in the discourse around fashion and materials is we miss the opportunity to actually go to these places and see, touch, smell, see, and experience all of those benefits and things that we talk about in a way that could feel really quite nebulous and completely disconnected from. So yeah, I wouldn't say we've been met with resistance, but we've been met with a lot of curiosity and a lot of sort of excitement of how we can reframe our relationship with materials that we are using in fashion that are fundamentally connected to something that can have a positive impact.
Listening to you talk, it strikes me that some of the challenges around leather production and the perception of leather production are quite similar to the food industry, insofar as where it's a global market and where globalization has meant that there's been pressure on perhaps poorer economies to produce an awful lot of stuff to a lower standard. That's where that perception builds. But what you're doing is creating or recreating a more localized national supply chain, and then telling that story. And I wonder, in terms of scaling that, how do we ensure that the right infrastructure and the right knowledge exists for pasture-based leather to be fully processed here at scale in Britain?
Great question. So I think it's really important to explain that hides aren't sold by a farmer, so they are sold and aggregated from an abattoir. So crucially, what we need to be able to do is work all along the value chain, from the farm to the finished material, and so that the users of that leather who are really wanting to understand the impact of the material they're using and its provenance are connected all the way down the supply chain, that they are a part of the decision making in and support of creating a new type of system. Because historically, a hide has been treated as an anonymous commodity. Revaluing that as something that is attached to different levels of impact requires, as we're talking about, new types of systems that need to have support. And so connecting and having the understanding from a customer side, in terms of not finished customer but user of leather, of really how far we've strayed from having these close interconnected supply chains and systems to having a very centralized and more industrialized production of leather, that unpicking and unweaving really will come at a time cost and a human personal relationship cost as well. And I think that personally, I don't think that is being brought into the discussion enough, that we can't just type in some information and pull out the hides that are attached to regenerative practices and not. It's really sort of ground level work of talking to the farmers of which abattoirs they use. How can we ensure that the value is retained, and that's going to be seen all the way through to a finished material. But what I would say is that we are we are met with enthusiasm from the farming community and many of the sort of stakeholders that are crucial in that supply chain, mainly because leather has been put in a bucket of, sometimes just seen as could only be bad. And so this opportunity to have more nuance in the conversation and potentially revalue that material, I think is a hopeful one. And I think that is shared by others that we're working with.
Thank you. And of course, as you mentioned there, within the abattoir sector, it's essential to have those smaller abattoirs that are able to process that and have that relationship with farmers. Now, Alana, you mentioned traceability earlier on, and today on 8.9, we've reported on a new platform by Better Cotton, which aims to deliver improved traceability in the cotton trade. Why is traceability such a challenge for natural fibres?
I think traceability is a huge challenge across the entirety of the fashion and textile sector. We've got traditionally very long and complex global supply chains, which can see garments travel thousands of miles from material sourcing to shop floor. A cotton t-shirt, for example, could source its cotton and fabric production in somewhere like China, could be produced in Bangladesh into garment form, and then could be obviously sold and shipped to the UK for retail purposes. Cotton in particular is complex due to cotton bales being sourced often from multiple locations and then spun into the same yarn, meaning that the origin of that particular cotton is largely unknown. And obviously that goes back to one of my previous points where we need to rely on accurate measurement of environmental impact, but that relies on transparency and traceability of all aspects within the value chain.
But thinking again about that supply and demand challenge that we started from in the first place, what role do you think different stakeholders play in driving change, from customers to governments? And who is it really that needs to lead that transition away from synthetic fibres?
I mean, obviously, all stakeholders have a really vital role to play in driving change. I'm a huge advocate for the power that consumers have, and consumers effectively vote with their money. So every pound they spend, they need to consider where they do that, and if the brand's values align with their own values as well. But we're also seeing a growing number of alternative purchasing and ownership models, which again need to kind of come into that conversation. Obviously, brands and their associated suppliers, manufacturers, they need to work collegiately to embed change in this hugely complex system. And as I mentioned before, we've been crying out for a long time for kind of legislation from governments. So it's kind of encouraging to see that. In terms of who's leading the transition, again, I think we've all got that role to play. But I also think we need to move away from some of those assumptions that just because things are natural, they're good. Obviously, every fibre has an impact. And I think, again, it calls for those kind of evidence-based, science-driven assessments to determine those preferred materials over the non-preferred.
Thank you. Now, Zoe, just finally, we've spent decades offshoring UK fashion production. So in terms of the UK, are we starting from scratch in terms of our processing capacity, or is there actually quite a healthy counterculture of smaller bast fibre producers already working here across Britain?
Yeah, there is. It's very small. Wool production has got some capacity, so do natural dyes to a certain extent, but bast fibres, we're almost starting from scratch, but there's growing interest and there's a lot of people, lots of engagement with hand processing, flax and hemp. But beyond this artisan scale, the small to medium on-farm scale is harder. Bast fibres need so much processing, and we don't have that set up yet. But there are some growers and practitioners trying to develop processing machinery. There's Malin Linen in Ireland have unearthed some ancient machinery. There's Rosie and Nick at Fantasy Fibre Mill in Scotland are creating some experimental machines. But there's a lot to do because we've lost the knowledge and the processing capacity we had. We've lost the culture of it. Like linen and hemp used to be grown and made in every town and village in the UK. So it's a very exciting space to be in with so much potential. And we've got a chance to make a fairer fibre economy. I mean, I think regenerative practices are first and foremost relational. So it's about relationships, it's about trust, it's about oh, I trust that farmer. I know that person down the road. I know they don't use chemicals. For me, it's not about measurement and data, although I understand you do need that because sometimes that is asked for, but a lot of it is on trust. Like I trust my local, I live in Devon, I buy veg from the Apricot Centre. They're not measured, but I trust the veg is grown with care and with respect for people and planet. And through the Bast Fibre Network, we're working within a bioregional frame. So members trying to develop capacity in their own places and putting their values at the core of decision making. So I think we don't need to compete. If we work regionally, we can work internationally. We can develop the systems, the processing machinery, the practices, the knowledge in and around the world and across Europe. And then we can share that knowledge open source in our places to develop best practices for our local situation. And I don't think we need to be competitive. And I'm interested in creating livelihoods, but I'm not interested in profit like mainstream fashion brands, which I think is the difference.
Zoe, thank you. And thank you, everyone. That's been a really fascinating conversation, but unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank my guests, Alice Robinson, Zoe Gilbertson, and Alana James. There's more news of the land every weekday on our website at 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.